Hi, welcome to Spiral Dynamics Integral Live. We are so excited to have Dr Nolan today, PhD. Eric is going to be sharing something called Fixing Global Issues Using Perspective Shifting Practices by Dr. Dr Nolan. So Eric will share his most recent research and discovery of the benefits gained when utilizing Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, the FQ model, within teaching and learning of, socioscientific. How do you say that, Eric?
Socioscientific.
Socioscientific issues. And if you hear the SSI, that's what he's talking about. The SSI framework is an educational theory that focuses on the teaching and learning of open-ended, often continuous and risk-based issues with an explicit focus on science and morality. Climate change is one of the such issues. So Eric taught and studied how graduate students gain deeper understandings of climate change through the exploration and decision-making, science, morals, ethics, policy, justice, equality, and sociocultural sensitivities, all of which relate to shifts in global and climate and regional climate. So is that probably a good introduction there, Eric?
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited. So let's all welcome Eric. Welcome, Eric.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm really excited to be here. I've attended a few of these conversations now with the SDI group, and I really love how everyone's just keeping the conversation going of really trying to look at the world a little bit more holistically and then sharing the communication and education of that. And I thought that's where my work with perspective would be particularly relevant to this group. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Dr Nolan, and I know the title is rather dramatic, but I think within my research, I have discovered something that can be used as a tool when it comes to communicating in spaces of decision-making. We have these really large global issues that I think everybody's trying to wrap their head around, that, you know, there's a high level of complexity. A lot of emergent factors are popping up, and we're trying to predict as best we can what might be happening. And it just seems like things are kind of running a little haywire right now. So as the image on the screen showcases, this is essentially looking at the 4 quadrants as a way of bringing about these wider means of perspective when we're looking at global issues and how we can utilize that into communication and education tools. So a little bit about me. I'm an education researcher. My PhD is in education, and I look specifically at the intersection of science and morality. How do we teach and learn scientific content, and then how do we contextualize that by the understanding of how science is used in society and the real world? So a framework that I've been working on is called Socioscientific Issues. My mentor, Dr. Dana Zeidler, he's in the University of South Florida. He studied under Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard, and Dana's work in the late 90s really started to catch on with, you know, this moral theory that's really going, you know, doing a deep dive on what does it mean to think of right and wrong, good and bad, and so forth. And he saw this school pipeline in the teaching of science that didn't exactly match up with bringing in these questions that are more fundamental to human living. So his work really went viral in the early 2000s, and now we have scholars from all around the globe who have taken up this framework and utilized it in one form or another. So that's a little bit of the sort of theoretical background that I have. But I also like to look at applied science education and perspective taking. That's what I specialize in. So I use this socioscientific issues framework and added to that. And I really wanted to focus on perspective taking as a practice within this framework. So that's sort of the academic side. I also have a side of my work that looks at public service and engages in public service. So I've been community organizing for over 10 years. I've also served in local government as a planning and zoning commissioner for the city of Flagstaff in Arizona, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I look at all kinds of issues, on the ground, policy issues, meeting people, getting out into the community, canvassing different neighborhoods, and just talking to folks and asking them what their needs are, and how government is running, and just in general, how's life. And I focus on issues like affordable housing, climate action, social justice, education, and sustainability, to name a few. I also wanted to mention, and this will be relevant, we talk a little bit more about one particular global issue, and it's that I did have a very fortunate opportunity to serve as a reviewer for the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a governing body of scientists from all around the world, and I was fortunate to be granted that opportunity to look at their draft work before it was going to be officially published for the public to look at. And it was a really good opportunity to see how the global narrative is taking shape within the scientific community, and then also seeing, you know, when you're talking to people out in the community, how they have a very different perspective on the same issue that is distinct from how scientists would see this. So I'm going to tap a little bit more into that as well. And then also just to say that within my doctoral studies, I really started to look at bringing in integral theory. And I've been studying integral theory actually going all the way back to the late 90s when I first picked up Ken's book on integral psychology. I had never seen anything like that before. And the appendix at the back of the book is particularly valuable because of the way that he stacks up all these different lines of development that you can sort of see that there's a there, something else is happening within the human experience that maybe we should be taking a look at. So integral theory really does guide my work now, and will be guiding my work for future research as well. So why education? Why did I choose that? And what does it mean? So for me, education, it's an interesting word, and I like to tap into etymology a little bit just to understand language and, you know, the words that we use and the meaning behind it. And when I looked up the origin of the word education, it was really interesting because I wasn't expecting to see this, but it stems back to essentially needing to lead out from within. And I thought about that and I'm like, that's not how I thought about education at all. I used to think about education as being synonymous with schooling. And those are not the same thing. Those are very, very different endeavors. And especially now that I'm well more versed and knowledgeable on the full extent of education, we definitely need to make sure that students recognize that school is not where their education stops. It continues out in our everyday operation, the way that we engage with one another, the way that we learn on that day-to-day basis. So this leading outward from within really does get at the heart of who I am as an educator, why I study education, and why I really use education as a philosophical foundation in everything I do. It constructs my worldview for my day-to-day living. So I started to think, what's the best way to educate a global issue? Well, I think by the teaching and learning of perspective. We should be able to relate with one another to allow for humanity's story to flow into the mainstream. By that meaning, I think a lot of us sense that, especially for those of us who are on social media. In some ways, I see bits of our humanity here and there, but the rest of it is a lot of the, nasty shadow side of what we do, where you just kind of see some foul play, at work every single day. So how then can we reinvigorate our humanity by really allowing one another to be where we are in life while tilting towards working on a better version of ourselves, or working on something within us that needs to heal or that needs to grow and continue developing? So within perspective, I thought maybe this might be a good way to do this. Let's think about some global issue and let's try to contextualize it in a way that maybe we all learn something. So when I started to Google the word perspective, I started to look around at different images, and I came across this one, and this one hit me as particular to what I'm trying to look for when I say perspective. And as you can see by the image here, depending on which wall you're looking at will determine the truth that you may think you're saying, that, hey, what I see is true. If I'm looking on the left, I see this sort of orange, rectangular, squarish looking image. If I look to the right, I see this sort of blue grayish circular image. And it could be true that what you're looking at is what you're looking at, but does that mean that it's the whole truth? And that's where I think sharing perspective with one another is really important. This is where I think diversity can be a strength to humanity in terms of, in academia especially, but I think it's more broadly in society. We're really trying to make a hard push for diversity, inclusivity, and equity. And I think the beginning steps on really incorporating that, so again, we can sort of bring back this sense of humanity, is through perspective. That if we can all just share our truths and communicate with one another and educate one another, that maybe this greater truth might enable us to operate in more relationship with one another, more relationship with the rest of the biosphere. So this is kind of the foundation of my philosophy in education. And you got to love the internet, because I found this, and then I think a few months later, somebody decided to, one up it, because that's what media is all about. And they took it even further and said, okay, well, you can take two perspectives, but what about 3 or 4 or 5 and so on? So this is where, the more perspectives we can include, perhaps we can actually get closer to a fundamental truth that we can all share with them. Okay, so when I say global issues, what am I talking about? Well, there's all sorts of different global issues. I mean, it could be anything from artificial intelligence to robotics to plastic pollution and so on. So I really wanted to contextualize one of these global issues within this perspective type of educational framework that can then be exercised in society to create these bigger changes that we need. And I focused on climate change. This is an issue, like I said, that I've been working on for about 10 years, just in advocacy and education, and really trying to get out there and help people understand what the science is saying, but exercise it in a way that can really create some on the ground change. So a lot of my work has been done in Flagstaff, Arizona. That's where it's down here in the southwest of the United States. It's right tucked in there with the Colorado Plateau, with a little bit of the basin and range surrounding area. So this is where we have a very arid environment, and it's one that shares a low-lying desert like Phoenix, and you have the high desert, which would be up here in Flagstaff. So it's still very arid. You still have that dryness of the desert air, but it's high enough in elevation that they get snow in the winter time, and they have, regular springs, summer. So they really have a good 4 seasons up there. But it still has that aridity, and that's going to be significant. So just to kind of talk about, so climate change is this global, really big issue. And I wanted to contextualize it by showing that an example of how climate change is an issue, meaning it has a real impact and it could negatively impact folks. And Flagstaff is a good example of this, where it's a very dry place. A lot of times it does not get rain. It does not get a whole lot of moisture up there. So the forest that's up there in the high desert, the ponderosa pine forest, is particularly dry, meaning it only takes a little flicker of a match being thrown from a campsite to start an entire forest fire. And a few years ago, they had one. It was called the Museum Fire, and it took out an entire slope on one of the mountains there. And what wound up happening is that, the summertime was really, really dry. A fire got started, wiped out the whole forest. It almost hit people's homes. It came right up onto that, where a lot of neighborhoods come right up onto the forest. It's federal forest land. And that fire touched up right there where it almost started to hit the homes. And luckily, the winds were taking it in the opposite direction. But a year or two later, when the water should have been wiped out, they got heavy monsoon rains, which now creates a flood risk for those very homes. No, yeah, I'm just trying to set the scene here that within the Southwest, when we're thinking about climate change, the key word really is change. And what does that mean? And for a place like Flagstaff, it means that if there are longer extended droughts, if within those periods where they get rain, it's not as frequent, but it's more intense, then it's creating all kinds of risks for the way the entire infrastructure has been designed, because infrastructure is the slowest thing to move. It's the slowest thing to change. So then how are we constructing our civilization in a way that won't be directly in the path of an effect caused by climate change through something like a new watershed being created, where now you have a flood zone that can drown out to those neighborhoods. So that's just kind of an example. Another example is here in California, we had this whole thing out here on the West Coast, this atmospheric river that just recently came through, this very unusual complete dumping of rain, and it was just constant for a good week there. And to help contextualize a little bit further about how climate change is kind of different for different regions and areas, I came across this map, which really shows reservoirs, water reservoirs across the entire state of California. So we had all this atmospheric rain, this record-breaking rain come in, and as you can see, depending on which reservoir and which part of the state, you didn't get the rain equally, which means that not every place is going to be impacted by climate change equally. It's a very, very dynamic system where in some cases, like Comanche and Cachuma, maybe that atmospheric river refilled your reservoir beyond historical averages, which may have taken that particular ecosystem out of drought for maybe another 10 years. But in other places of the state, it barely hit anywhere near the historic average, which means that in 2 years, they're going to be right back into an extreme drought condition. So climate change is a very dynamic process where it depends on the actual geographic location. It depends on the ecosystem. A lot of factors play into how that ecosystem is going to be impacted. But I wanted to demonstrate the complexity of this global issue and what does it really mean to try to fix something like that, where you have so many moving pieces happening all in the same moment. So I wanted to really give a concrete example. So I thought I would use Flagstaff. It's what I'm the most familiar with. And what we see on top here with this graph is a specific measurement of annual average temperatures in Flagstaff, Arizona. And this goes all the way back to 1895, all the way up to about 2017. And you can see that there's a particular trend there. Like we see a lot more of those red lines coming more recently since the mid 90s. So within this, I wanted to show that if we compare that Flagstaff, that regional look with the global average temperature, it kind of stacks up. So, a lot of people who are skeptical about climate change say like, oh, well, this graph doesn't necessarily indicate anything. And it's like, okay, well, let's compare that. Let's actually go to a specific place and look at what sort of changes are taking place and how would that potentially cause a risk. So we can see that Flagstaff pretty much matches up with the global average when it comes to atmospheric temperatures around the world on average. So we can see this sort of regional and global connection. And this is just kind of looking at like, okay, so I'm going to use Flagstaff as a concrete example, but let's also, keep our sights on this global look and what does it mean to see in like the bottom bar graph there. What that bar graph is showing is global average temperatures going back to 1895 to where we're at today. And as you can see, the further to the right that we go, that doesn't look good. It means that we're dynamically shifting our chemical and physical properties within the atmosphere. And we're doing that at such an accelerated rate that scientists from all over the world are trying to look at the full scope and impact, and that complexity gets really, really deep when you think of the rest of Earth's dynamic systems. So basically, that's what climate change means to me. That's been my experience. That's what I've been focusing on. But here's where the perspective comes back into it. But so what? What does climate change mean to you? And what does climate change mean to us? Now, I can take an authoritative tone and say like, well, unless everybody understands climate change the way that I do, then, you know, they're lazy, they don't get it, they don't want to get it, and they're the problem. Or I have to look at it as people are just at where they're at in their interpretation of this. You know, I'm not living the everyday experience of other people. So maybe people are distracted by their job, or maybe they have a physical ailment that's really capturing most of their attention, or maybe they're, you know, kind of wandering off into different spaces. All of that is well and good. But when I'm thinking about this global issue, it's like, but this is going to impact everybody. So how can I possibly communicate in a way that people can at least begin to understand a little bit of the complexity so they can observe it for themselves? So I thought a good way to kind of introduce this is just to kind of look at climate change along the spiral. I know this group likes to look at this, and it's kind of exciting that I can talk in this language, because, and people who aren't familiar with this framework, they're just kind of like, huh, what do you mean spiral? So on the left, the color coding is built on the spiral dynamics coding model. And then on the right, I use the color coding that Integral uses. So if you're kind of wondering why there's a color difference there, I just kind of wanted to include both. So if we think about climate change along the spiral, and really how would a person reasoning within this particular stage look or experience climate change, at beige or infrared, the physiological focus would be on bodily needs, where climate change isn't even in my consciousness because I'm too busy focused on my physical sensations and experience. If we were at a purple or a magenta, then it would be sort of this subjective familiarity shared with others in the environment, that my direct environment is my home. It's not necessarily a planet. I'm just focused on my home. I'm in my house, my sort of cave. My direct schema is my world. I don't really extend beyond that. So whatever interacts with me within that setting is what I interpret with familiarity. But anything outside of that, I don't really pay attention to. If we think about it at red, this might be somebody who then wants to control the environment. I want my home and my neighborhood to be within my control, that I function within a community where I'm known and I'm seen, and I can interact with others. And then I thought about like, okay, well, maybe somebody who might come across like something talking about climate change at blue or amber, how would they interpret that? And I'm thinking there was a point even when I started out where when it came to environmental issues, I just did whatever the rule said I had to do, just whatever. I don't know anything about this. I'll adhere to whatever the law or the rule is, but I'm not going to be doing extra homework. I'm not going to go and think about this on my own. Just tell me what I have to do and I'll do that. So it's this interpretation that the bare minimum is whatever the social contract is. What's problematic though is that the social contract, just like any documentation of a rule or law, it just becomes dogmatic, where people aren't practicing critical thinking at this stage or mode of reasoning. You're just saying that all I have to do is agree to the rules. I get into society, we're all good. I'm going to keep it moving and keep focusing on something else. I'm not going to worry about climate change. It's just not on my radar. So climate change can be interpreted in very, very different ways depending on the life conditions of the person as they're going through their day-to-day interactions. But how then can we get people to just start asking questions in an orange type of framework? So how can we get folks to just start recognizing objective and subjective patterns? So objectively, can I recognize like, wow, you know, I've been living in this city for 30 years. And I don't ever remember the heat waves lasting this long. Like maybe during the summer it would kind of get hot, but this seems to be extended and longer, where summers are just dredging on. It's not like just a few weeks there that might hit above the 90s. The 90s is the new norm. So what is that? How am I thinking about this? I'm observing something new. Should I be worried? Should I be concerned? So that orange way of thinking and way of reasoning is really where we kind of want people to start to peak when it comes to climate change. Don't just do the bare minimum, because that's not good enough. There are a lot of vested interests out there that want to keep doing business as usual. They want people to keep operating the same method. And for those of us who have looked deeply into that, that's exactly what we have to shift from. So we have to get away from this consumerist society and mindset to really tap into, but what is the earth showing us that we should be paying attention to? So within that orange level, that's where climate change really starts to show as like this pattern recognition of Earth's dynamic systems. And then at green, it's really acknowledging the complexity of dynamic systems, both human and natural, that we start to realize like the Earth has a lot of dynamic systems. We're not just talking about greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's albedo effect. There's carbon absorption. There's all sorts of mechanisms that play into how the Earth is operating right now, but it's very complex. And then that even aside, human beings are complex. Not everybody is seeing and being the same in the world. And how can we observe these very dynamic systems in this larger thing that we're calling climate change? Not all communities are going to be impacted equally. Some communities are going to be in different geographic locations and be heavily disadvantaged compared to others. So how then can we really acknowledge the complexity of those dynamic systems? And then we can get up to a point where yellow or teal is we accept and work within biospheric systems. This is where we really sort of can take a step back and say like, okay, I want to advocate for climate change. I want to stop fossil fuels. If I protest, is that going to fix the problem? Well, kind of, but not really, because the thing that's actually going to fix the problem is we have to somehow reach the powers that be. And we're talking like, extremely wealthy corporations, extremely wealthy governments. And we have to convince that leadership that, hey, action on the ground needs to be taken. Protesting can kind of get their attention, but you have to dig way deep into policy, and you have to meet people, and you have to really understand that in order to facilitate change. Because if you don't really know what you're working with on the ground, then you're somebody that's just kind of making it known what your virtue is. And I applaud that. I'm down with that. But it has to be more than that. It can't just be virtue signaling. It has to be meeting with people, actually forming a plan and getting us to shift our societal practices. So rather than 10% of the population understanding climate change and advocating for it, it becomes 50%, 60%, that really there's an awakening within our humanity of, hey, wow, we really need to wake up and change everything we're doing day to day to compensate for these larger issues that are unfolding. So that's a little bit about spiral dynamics and the integral model along the spiral that I thought would be just to kind of introduce how climate change can be looked at each one of these stages or levels. So that brings me back to the 4 quadrants. So spiral dynamics aside, I think that's just kind of something to put in the back of our thinking. But I want to come back to like, okay, so we have this complexity. There's different ways that people can be seeing and experiencing climate change. How can I, as an educator, as an effective educator, tap into that? How can I get into a practice of perspective taking that can really bring out the nuances that people can start to tap into climate change, whatever level that they're at, and start to recognize the pattern of Earth's systems? And that's what drew me to the 4 quadrant. How can we educate using perspective to promote growth and development along the spiral? So the 4 quadrant model, we're all familiar with this. Sean Esborn-Hargens and Zach Stein have also written in their books on the 4 quadrants. I like the language that they use. It very much resonates with me because The four quadrants, there's like the I, the we, the it, the it's, and some people get that. Some people are still kind of lost on what that means. But this language, I feel, is just pretty straight and to the point that in the upper left quadrant, one focus, it's a person's subjectivity, an individual's interior intention and meaning. In quadrant two, the individual's actions and behavior, if we think about that in an objective sense. In the lower left, in quadrant three, the interior of a collective, which is our culture and shared meanings. And this is really important in the way that we exchange subjectivity, that intersubjectivity that we're cultivating with one another. Or a lower right, exterior collective, look at social systems and environment. So objectively, how do we interact with one another on a day-to-day basis? So I really like how this can look at perspective in ways that really can bring out those extra layers and dimensions if we're going to look at something like climate change. So my research has a very simple vision to find perspectival tools that can help fix large-scale problems. So how do we tap in with one another? So the frameworks of perspective that I'm using, like I mentioned in the very beginning, is socioscientific issues. This is the intersection of science and morality, and the four-quadrant model from Ken Wilber's work. So socioscientific issues, these are personally relevant, controversial, ill-structured, open-ended problems, meaning we don't know what the answer is on the other end of this. So it's not like I'm in a classroom teaching an algebra course and I give you a book and you can go home and do your homework, go to the back of the book and look at the answer to make sure that you did the whole thing right and got what you should have gotten at the end. That is not what a socioscientific issue is. We don't know what's going to come out on the other end. We don't have that answer. So how then do we use scientific evidence-based data in our reasoning to inform decisions about these sorts of topics? So employing the use of scientific topics with social ramifications that engage in dialogue, discussion, debate, argumentation, discourse helps us to illuminate the knowledge that needs to be known, allowing people's values to come into the sharing of that knowledge. And if you have differing values, it actually is a really big benefit because chances are there's different evidence that they're going to bring into the conversation. And I'm not talking about people who are, arguing for the sake of arguing or, they're just trying to trigger people. I'm not talking about the jokesters out there. I'm talking about serious conversations where there may be differences in values, but I think there's a way that we can remedy those differences by sharing in that perspective and really allowing that to reveal a greater truth. So then how can we integrate implicit and or explicit ethical components with some degree of moral reasoning? And basically what this means is, if we're going to look at something like climate change, it's not so much that the teaching and learning of this should be like, you should think this is a moral issue. This is, you should think this is right or wrong or good or bad. That's not what this is. What it's saying is, can we reason with one another that even if you don't see this as a moral issue, you can recognize that others do. And that's the ethical component. It's not an indoctrination, it's more of an awakening. Can you see why these people would see climate change as a moral issue? And for the people over here who see that as a moral issue, can they communicate in a way that articulates the reasoning behind their morality? This is why we think this is bad. This is why we think this is wrong. Here's some evidence. Here's, a specific place where not only was the land affected, but the people who live there were too. And how can that then open up this wider conversation of what we can do about it? So the socioscientific issues framework really wants to illuminate that sort of openness and perspective to learn about these more complex issues. Now, the diagram that I have on there, that's just an old one. Dana Zeidler, the one who came up with this framework, he put this together in the early 2000s, and basically it's just a way for science educators to look at cultivating scientific functional literacy. And the key word really being functional, that it's not just about learning static, isolated facts about chemistry or physics or Earth's dynamic systems, but what are we doing with that? What's the function of that when we contextualize that within social groups and social settings? So I focus more on perspective taking. So socioscientific perspective taking is a suite of perspective taking practices that ideally occur during the negotiation of an SSI. So whether we're in a community group or a classroom, how can we bring about perspective taking that can start to break down the issue and negotiate what we think we should do in one area and how that may impact another area? So what should we do over there? And constantly connecting where the real problems lie within this greater issue. And a couple things that are needed in order to achieve this sort of perspective taking is engagement, etic-emic shifts, and moral context. And I'm going to briefly go over all of those. So how can we use engagement and a shift in our perspective to really help bring out a moral context of these particular issues? So let's start with the word engage. So again, I like to go back to the origin of words just because I think it's interesting to see where these come from. And when I came across the origin of this word, I'm like, okay, that's exactly what I'm trying to say when I say engagement. It's how do we pledge oneself to do something? Or how do we involve ourselves in an activity that may involve the recognition of someone or something else other than me? So if I'm engaging the issue, it means I want to engage and learn about how other people outside of my own people are experiencing climate change. I want to see what they're doing. So therefore I want to engage. So that's key is if we want to bring about this perspective, then the first step is to engage others in some capacity or another. And the other is this etic and emic shift. And basically, these are words that may sound kind of familiar if you think about the word phonetic or phonemic. It's a way of thinking of how an outsider would listen to somebody talking, meaning if somebody's speaking a language I don't understand, I don't know what they mean, and I'm an outsider to that. It just sounds like sound to me. I'm not breaking it down into words, sentences, ideas, and all of that. I'm just hearing random noises coming out of their mouth. So how does that etic understanding, that outsider understanding of others, play into an emic understanding or an insider understanding where this is a common language where these are not random sounds, you're constructing a larger idea and informing me of your interpretation, and I can share in that exchange so we can mutually communicate with one another. So how do we create a shift from understanding groups outside of our own, just as, oh, they're the outsiders, I don't understand what they're thinking or where they're coming from, to at least having that insider perspective? And it's not whether or not you agree or disagree, but do you at least understand where these other groups are coming from and the way that they have constructed their worldview within their own communities? So these sort of etic-emic shifts are a part of this perspective taking practice. Kenneth Pike is a scholar who operated out of Texas, and he was a linguist. He wrote a book called Language in Relation to a Unified Theory of the Structure of Human Behavior. He really did a deep dive on descriptive linguistics, specializing in Mexican and indigenous languages throughout Mesoamerica. And throughout a lot of his work, reaching out, originally he was translating biblical texts, and throughout his journey, just meeting all of these different subcultures within the area of Mexico, he really started to realize like language is really complex. These people are not all speaking the same language. Like we call it Spanish, but they're still indigenous dialects that differ from other ones that are in a very similar region. So what's this all about? And he wrote quite extensively on that. And I love to pull out some of his quotes because I think it gets to the heart of his work, where he once wrote, "As I developed my linguistic principles, I discovered they extended far beyond language and linguistics. They spilled over into areas like anthropology, religion, sociology, and philosophy. In fact, they turned out to be general principles about human nature itself." And I think that this is important because within this perspective taking, it does come down to language. I'm not going to be able to access anybody's insight or framework if I don't have language that's going to make sense to them. So how can I explore language in a way that can really start to bridge these gaps so we can develop deeper shared meanings with one another to hopefully address these larger issues, such as climate change. Another quote that I have at the bottom there: revelation and the nature of truth must be viewed in reference to the structure of language. Language is a tool adequate to provide any degree of precision relevant to a particular situation. So climate change is an interesting one, because even if somebody doesn't speak English, I can point to an ecosystem and show if it's damaged or not. I can still find ways of communicating with a different kind of language. And this, to me, starts to open up perspective. What do we mean by language? What do we mean by communication and education? When what we're trying to do is just share understandings with one another to hopefully build a greater awareness of these larger issues. Okay, so I just want to take a quick inhale and an exhale, because this is a lot of information. I know it is. So then we have engagement, we have these epistemic shifts, and how is that going to elicit perspective taking within a moral context? The set and setting of how morality can be viewed is important, because we all reason within our morality differently and at different times and depending on the issue and so forth. And what I like about Sammy Kahn's work, she originally developed this socioscientific perspective taking, where she brought together reasoning modes that show rationalistic qualities, emotive qualities, or intuitive qualities. That when we think about something like climate change, we may think about it rationally, where if I were in somebody else's shoes, how would I logically want to construct my way out of this problem or change operation to compensate for carbon emissions? Or in some cases, people just feel empathy. We're like, you know what? I don't understand the science. I'm honestly not interested in that. What I'm interested in are people being harmed, are people in harm's way. You know, I care about those people. So we reason more from that space. Or it could be just an intuitive look at climate change. Like, you know what? I don't understand the science. I don't know how people are going to be involved, but I just have a gut feeling that this is bad. I can't quite articulate why I think this, but I just get this very deep sense that something's off here. So this is a way of really bringing about, if we're listening to one another and if we're listening to groups outside of our own and we're really extending our perspective, listening to these types of reasoning modes can really flesh out how people are holding their particular value system and worldview and essentially perspective on something like climate change. So kind of coming back to the 4 quadrants, when I started to think about the etic and emic difference, or the distinction between the two, I started to realize that really the etic is defining a quadrant 4 look at how we relate with one another, that it's just really sort of this objective exchange of noises and sounds. But emically, if we can cultivate that, then what we're doing is that we're actually taking the relationships in a Q4 context and moving it into this exchange of subjectivity. And this is important as we move forward with how do we cultivate perspective in a way that can really lead towards fixing these larger issues so we can see the holistic quality of it all. So socioscientific perspective taking using the 4 quadrants is where my research comes in. I really wanted to see how can I apply this not only in a classroom teaching undergraduates, but also within my political life to bring about change and an awareness and perspective. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into detail on this. This is just basically merging socioscientific perspective taking and the 4 quadrants. And within this framework, within this model, this is what has enabled me to communicate with thousands of people at this point and really start to make a shift in how people see climate change as an issue and what we should be doing about it. And the thing that I want to point out is that within quadrant 3, I call this etic-emic integration, meaning that within a Q3 space, if we can open up dialogue and we can share communication in a way, we can start to understand one another. And this could be in terms of groups, or it can be in terms of just 2 individuals trying to better understand how they both see climate change. But we're exchanging our perspective to really gain that deeper understanding of me having an inside understanding of your view, and you have an inside understanding of my view. So if we can engage others, if we can cultivate this etic-emic integration, if we can have something like in quadrant 2 engagement with self, and this is, you know, perhaps a whole other lecture, but how do we look at ourselves objectively in the mirror to say, what's my responsibility to climate change? Am I doing enough? Am I doing homework just to at least pay attention and to take notice of what's dynamically changing, or not? So how can we also engage with ourselves just to recognize that, okay, even if I don't think this is a big issue or a big deal, these other people do. So how am I showing up for how others are seeing significant issues? And then the real etic-emic shift would happen more in that quadrant 1 space, that it just depends on the individual and their interpretation, or I should say their subjective understanding and how they've created meaning around this that will ultimately determine whether or not I have an inside understanding of how others see it or not. And then the moral context also would be held within a quadrant 1 space. So this model just kind of begins to open up the complexity, hopefully in a way that we can start to look at, okay, now how can we build communication and education tools that can connect these 4 quadrants, which are happening simultaneously anyways, in a way that cohesively looks at a particular issue. So I did this by constructing a climate survey and analyzing the data that came from that, just looking at the reasoning modes from open-ended qualitative questions, meaning I'm not trying to quantitatively analyze this. I want to know specifically how is a person answering a question relevant to each of the quadrants. So like the first question in quadrant 1, what does the thought of climate change mean to me? I'm asking that not because there's an answer I'm expecting. If you don't think of greenhouse gases, that's fine. I'm just trying to tap into, but what about climate change are you thinking about? Well, you know, climate change means to me, I just kind of see it on social media. I don't really think about it much, but yeah, I see it in headlines from time to time. That's great. As an educator, that's a starting point for me to realize, like, okay, that's where you're at in this. So how can I then tailor this, you know, huge amount of knowledge and information to start to begin to introduce, like, how can this be relevant to you? How can climate change particularly impact you and your neighborhood and your environment? And just kind of, I won't go through all the questions, but if you just kind of look at them in each one of the quadrants, it's just really fleshing out climate change in a very contextualized way. You know, looking at our own actions and behavior, thinking about, you know, our own communities and how we maybe discuss the issue or maybe don't, or looking at it in like a quadrant 4 focus, which is like, you know, how are other places around the world or within my own country actually creating policies and changes in our operating system that have a role to play in climate change. Now, walking somebody through these questions, and especially if you can do it longitudinally, which is what I did with my students, I gave them the same exact survey 4 times throughout the semester. And then at the end of the semester, I gave them back their responses and told them to write up a reflection piece. That was the most insightful because it meant that they started to think about climate change in these 4 quadrant ways. And then by the end, by having them look back and put all of it together with, okay, but where am I at my thinking in this? That's where things really started to light up. And I started to notice a shift in the way that students started out thinking about the issue and where they wound up. So this is just a simple diagram that I put together to indicate where students were at in their initial understanding at the beginning of the semester. So for each color, it's the darker shade represents where they were at in their understanding of climate change in the beginning of the semester. As they progress through, their shifting moved into a different quadrant focus. And that was the most insightful for me because I'm like, that's interesting because, you know, I learned this in my master's too. I just didn't put it in quadrant language, but in my master's, I studied something very similarly where I had a different climate survey asking undergraduate students about what they know about climate change. And they understood the issue either on a personal level, a societal level, or a global level, but they didn't really translate between all three of those. So they were kind of like in one area on the issue, but that's about all they knew. That's all they really thought about. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then what I realized in my dissertation when I used the 4 quadrants is that, oh, this even gets more detailed, that they're starting off in maybe a highly subjective area. And over time, they start to think about their actions and how that plays out into a larger ecosystem. Or somebody may have already thought about their personal behaviors, but now want to focus more on how they're communicating it with others to help educate. So by learning this about the reasoning modes of the participants in my study, what this really allowed me to do as an educator and a communicator is to tap into, oh, this is how people are thinking about this global issue. This is a place for me to tap into. So I started to do that and apply a lot of what I was learning within my doctoral studies, also within my political life, doing public service, because education, again, is not schooling. Education is a part of my everyday life. So I want to know that when I'm interacting with people, I have a sense of what their starting point is for a larger issue. And then how can I work them through different dimensions that maybe bring out a newness that they can learn. Okay, so just kind of getting close to wrapping everything up. So the model that I came up with for socioscientific perspective taking using the 4 quadrants, seeing the different reasoning modes from participants that I've studied who are thinking about these global issues like climate change and how can the 4 quadrants maybe bring about a learning mechanism that can communicate a little bit better the complexities that are involved in this. All of that then I feel can start to look at spiral dynamics and how can we use climate change as a learning example to walk folks through reasoning modes that can get them to at least orange. So that way, individually, they can start to recognize those patterns and then, you know, hopefully cultivate change, which is more closer to like the yellow and teal stages where people can take full accountability and really work in the communication with the others on problem solving. So when it comes to applying this in the real world, I'm all about that. I am actively pursuing any and all professor positions that look at climate risk and decision making. What I've realized is problematic when it comes to where most institutions are looking for decision making when it comes to climate change is something like what I'm displaying now, which is what the IPCC report shows. And essentially, this is a whole schematic on how, you know, decision making is done, and you have decision makers and you have to choose certain actions. And then there's the real world, which includes society, industry, environment, and so on. And I'm thinking the whole time while I'm looking at this, like, wow, this is really sophisticated and it's really great. And it is. I'm not necessarily knocking it. But it's also on the premise of, but we still live in a capitalistic society. We still live in a consumeristic society. And I don't really see that being addressed here. And that's where I'm thinking that the perspective taking can really start to illuminate voices that typically are not brought into decision-making spaces. So I think about Indigenous communities. Being in Flagstaff, Arizona, I got to meet a lot of Navajo elders, and they have a very different relationship to the land that I'm seeing from most Americans, particularly European settlers who just kind of have this unbelievable consumeristic attitude and orientation. And the majority, I'm not saying that that's everybody. There's, you know, I think folks out there who live more humbly, but the majority of the culture in the United States is just to consume without thinking twice. You know, it keeps the economy moving, and that's what we value more than everything. So how then in these decision-making schematics do we start to bring in something like an Indigenous voice? Or are there other ways of being where we don't have to push so hard to live in a consumeristic society, but we can still share in an exchange of goods and services and so on? So the applied findings of my work is to address these sort of orange dominated schematics of decision making to really bring out a different sort of nuance that, hey, there might be other ways that we can shift our perspective and actually fix these larger global issues if we just look at how all these different groups of human beings are going about their day to day, to see if maybe solutions are already in front of us. We just have to tap into those who are around us to get a greater understanding of their perspective. So that is what I have.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. That was wonderful. Super, super interesting. It's something that we've talked about the environment, but I think we've all been wanting to go into climate change a little bit more specifically and deeply because it's such a pressing problem, and yet we seem to not know how to talk about it. And so you've just presented us with some really good techniques. So I guess now we'll go to the discussion part of this, and Bet has her hand up. So let's see what Bet has to say.
This was really, really amazing and so well thought out. And I had like 10 different aha moments. But one thing that I learned from a book called Poor Economics is that if you want people who are maybe at the bottom layer of society who are just trying to climb up, if they're either kids or just people who are poorer, but you have to make it so easy for them. You just have to make it so easy. So they may not even be aware of climate change, but you have to create the systems so that every day the choices they make are just creating goodness, right? So that was just something I was thinking, because I thought maybe you were saying like everyone has to have this awareness of climate change at one of these levels, but I think that there's processes we can put in place so that people can just make decisions based on like, I need to feed my family today, but the options that are available are just so great that all of them are good for the environment and making the world a better place. Anyways, I just want to throw that out there because not everyone has to understand. Like, for instance, in the old days, people used to burn wood, and that was just how they did it. And now we have cleaner fuel sources, and it's not like my neighbors are making decisions on like, oh, what kind of fuel source? It's just like the one that's there, that's available, is the cleanest one. So anyways, right. Great job, exactly. Eric. I love this. This is cool.
Thank you. And Josh, your hand is up too, and I just want to quickly address your comment about the museum fire being caused by logging. It absolutely was caused by logging. The forest, however, had also been particularly dry. I mean, for at least the last, like 5 or 6 years, every summer we were having pretty high fire restrictions in the area because it's just basically, a fuel tank that's waiting to go up. It was so dry. So yeah, the combination of those two is definitely what set off that fire.
Yeah, well, the irony is that the logging was done under the auspices of trying to prevent fire, and it's something I've been working on. It's actually very dubious, and actually the studies are showing that it actually makes it worse. And it's ironic when the thing that's supposed to fix the problem actually creates it. But that's a side note. Yeah, I really appreciated the presentation. I thought a lot of great models there, and using the integral model for climate, and then putting the specific questions in there, because it can be pretty vague. You're like, okay, interior, okay, and then we pretend to understand that. So then when you have those questions in there, that's really helpful. So that's great. Let's see, I guess 2 points I have is obviously climate change is very, very essential. At the same time, it is only a component of what I call the ecological unraveling. And I think you can't talk about the unraveling without climate change, but a lot of climate change discussion doesn't include the other pieces like land conservation, toxics, whatever. And in fact, a lot of what's being done under the auspices of climate change, such as logging in forests is actually making all of those situations worse. So that's just, a caution in that regards, but also in terms of trying to convince people who aren't on board with climate change at all, it's such a nebulous thing, that's hard to prove. And then, most people, probably even me, don't really understand the science anyway. So it's like, no, it's happening. And they're like, yeah, whatever, it's magic. But you can take somebody out to a place where there were trees and then a logging company's cut down all the trees. You can be like, look, the trees aren't there anymore. And there, there's all this spin right now, which is we have to do it and it's whatever. But I just think that there is it's difficult to prove. And I think the harping on only climate change might be a weak point. Again, not saying that we shouldn't be talking about it. So I'm not dismissing your climate change presentation. I'm just saying, hopefully we can be nesting these things in a larger piece. And then I guess my last thing would be, so regarding engagement, what about the fact that most of the people who are pretending to engage on things are doing so in bad faith? And the idea that, all right, let me hear what this person who either has no knowledge of or no desire to understand, or will just dismiss out of hand everything that's being said, bringing them into the room, having to slow everything down to try to convince them that this thing is real, when what we need to be doing is modeling how we can move forward. Do you feel like that may be a waste of time?
No, I don't. And the reason why I say that is, so right at the time that I was wrapping up my PhD, I ran for local office as a council member, city council candidate. And, Flagstaff has like a pretty good mix of people on the right side of things, people on the left side of things. And people on the right side were very skeptical when they first approached me. They thought like, oh, here we go, another person who's liberal or Democrat or whatever, and they're going to have a script that they're going to try to convince me and convert me to. And that just wasn't the case. When I would approach people, first of all, I've been largely registered as an independent. I do tend to vote Democrat just because, as far as what I'd like to see prioritized, I tend to see Democrats focus on that more. But I didn't want that to shut down the conversation. So it was more about listening to where folks are coming from, that I didn't really have any issues. It really allowed people to feel heard, that I'm not going to pounce on if they have a different way of seeing things. If you don't value climate change, you don't value climate change. That's not going to trigger me in any way. But if I can listen to where you're coming from, then that informs me, because in those decision-making spaces, like even being on our planning and zoning commission, I can take that perspective into those moments and share that commentary in that sort of forum, in a public forum. And that's why I think local government is important, because if you can bring out how somebody doesn't value something, then we can look at like, okay, well, how like climate change is impacting everything. So at that point, you're just trying to find a contact point. So like you're saying, if somebody goes outside and they can notice that their trees are being chopped down, that's one thing. But if you can also show them like, hey, remember like a summer ago on your local news, they were saying that they've never seen a heat wave like this before. Well, yeah, I saw that. That's an entry point to have that conversation there, and then just walk them through evidence. And that's where the evidence-based argumentation comes from. I'm not going to go off into my own subjectivity on the matter. If you don't know me and I don't know you, and you're already skeptical of whatever values I have, I'm going to show you government reporting. I'm going to show you what's been measured and have the conversation from there. I'm not going to try to convert anybody beyond that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, as a politician, I would see you got to listen to the constituents, but does that really move actions forward in terms of climate change? To just know, like, I mean, I know why people don't believe in climate change, and it's a nice thing to listen to them and be like, I understand you, that's great. But if it's like there's a specific number that needs to be reached in terms of, say, emissions, if that's the issue, and it's like, whatever, let's just say it's 350. And these people are like, it doesn't matter, it's 20 million, who gives a shit? And they were like, well, let's split the difference. 350 and, you know, 20 million divided by 2, let's do that. And then the answer is we're fucked, right? So I guess, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I guess my just concern is that at a certain point in time, listening to people who are wrong, who are objectively wrong on an issue, doesn't that stymie progress? And you're saying, no, it's an important component of, is it a separate component? And then we're actually doing what we should be doing while we're just, you know, patting these people on the back and making them feel like they're not wrong. Like, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important that we really not forget why democracy is around, why this is a part of our operation, because what I've experienced more often than not, for even people who are highly skeptical and don't even believe in climate change, the second I start showing them data, there's usually a humility that kicks in where they're like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. I'm full of shit. I don't know what I'm talking about. And that sort of conversation is where the educator in me has to be there and show up for that person. Or I could have somebody else where like Jordan Peterson is a good example of this, because I think he kind of does it in an asinine way, but he has looked at some of the climate science, and yeah, the climate science isn't as totally negative and bad as a lot of media propagandizes it. And he focuses on that and hyper focuses and won't really go beyond that. We're like, no. This one little fact over here that says that, you know, some places are going to have an extended growing season. Isn't that going to be good to provide more food? Like, okay, you want to keep that conversation there, you go ahead and do that. I'm going to look at everything else that's contextualized around the fact that you're pointing out, and that's where I can meet his argument. And for people that want to play that game, for lack of a better word, to me, it's really easy to just, it's almost like in a way you're dismantling their logic in front of them, because they can only do that if they take an authoritative tone. We're like, nobody better question me. I'm the authority here. I know what I'm talking about. Climate change isn't real. But it's like, well, hold on a second. Let me give you concrete examples of how you're wrong. So that's where I usually enter into that part of the framework. But and again, I do that through perspective, because that tends to be what really illuminates where are the places we should care, you know, who are the people that are going to be being harmed. So if you're saying climate change isn't real, well, let me give you another example of in the Southwest, particularly where it's dry and water is really, really scarce. Indigenous communities are literally dying off. They're literally getting sick because their aquifers are not being recharged. So they're left with dirty water, and they have to make that last all throughout the hot summer. So I'm just saying that I'm not omnipotent by any stretch of the imagination. So I also have to just work within the bounds of a functioning democracy. Who else out there is talking about it? Who shows up to these conversations? But I've realized that the more that I extend my perspective, the more that I am likely to understand the countering points argument almost better than they do, because I've already worked through your reasoning. I can come to the same determination that you did, but then I'm going to unfold it and bring out all this other context that now starts to pull out this very reduced way of framing the narrative to really show those broader impacts.
Well, you've got a lot more patience than I do, so good on you.
Thank you.
Eric, I have two questions that are somewhat hooked together. First one, really, when you showed the slide of how somebody who from a spiral dynamics standpoint started with in one of the quadrants, and then over the course of the longitudinal discussions shifted to other quadrants. I guess the one thing I noticed was there's no orange in there. What's that about?
Oh, so my apologies. I didn't think about that when I put it up here. I would have maybe changed that. These colors are not spiral dynamics colors. So I apologize if I created that confusion. These were just colors to show that these are different people that have their own, experiences and interpretations. And it's really just trying to show that these are 4 different participants in the way that they traverse the 4 quadrants.
Okay. So the blue, red, yellow, green do not tie to where the spiral dynamic developmental stage is.
Yeah, and I apologize for that confusion. It didn't dawn on me to word that, but yeah, that's correct.
Well, okay, that's thank you very much for clarifying that. My second question, I'll kick it off in the slide where you had the various questions to be asked depending on which quadrant you were discussing. In the 3rd quadrant, there was the question, what values do family and community hold toward climate change? And one of the things that I've been learning in over time, and particularly a lot of the reading I've been doing lately, is that humans are very, very social beings, and fear of losing status in their social group, i.e. family, community, really is really important. I mean, it's like a major human factor. People don't want to lose status in their support groups. And so when somebody, when you encounter somebody whose family and community value is negative towards climate change, generally you can run into essentially, first of all, cognitive dissonance in their mind. And then that usually kicks in confirmation bias. And it's as a defense mechanism to, my family / community, however I define that, says climate change is a bunch of hooey. And I've just been presented with a bunch of facts that show that no, it's real. Often that kicks in cognitive dissonance, and which then ensues to confirmation bias and very defensiveness. Could you give some examples? It sounds like you've been working in this a long time. Could you give some examples in your various encounters where you've run into this, and how did you deal with it?
Let me know if this example works for what you're talking about. So let's say the membership I have in my relationship with my mother. She's my family. I was raised by a single parent, and I love her dearly. When I first joined the environmental movement, this was about in 2008, I became very impassioned because, wow, there's plastic pollution piling up on the beaches of Los Angeles, and this is wrong. We got to get off of plastics now. And I started to educate myself, and I started to learn about the chemistry involved, and I started to learn about how, this is impacting places all over the world. And I started to really consider myself almost a second tier thinker at that point, because I was also reading about spiral dynamics. And I'm like, well, I must be yellow because, the green would kind of acknowledge that, hey, the biosphere is more than just human beings. And then the yellow is like, okay, well, I want to fix this. I'll work with anybody. I try to communicate with my mother on, can you please use reusable bags? And her understanding of plastic pollution was that, is it really that big of a deal? They have the recycling, thing at the grocery store to take your bags back. So, it must fix the problem. And I didn't want to lose my relationship with my mother. We have an inner subjectivity between us that I highly value, and I don't want to lose that status. I don't want to reduce my mother that we're just this quadrant 4 interpretation of one another. I want to know that we can share in our understanding and our meaning of the world with one another. And it took a lot of work for me to realize that I'm not going to change her, because even though I would ask her to do that, if I would visit her 6 months later, she's right back to using the plastic bags from the grocery store. And there was a tension there because it's like, okay, I want you to see there's a bigger issue happening with plastics, and you don't want to change, it seems like. It's just like you don't want to be bothered by it. So how am I going to maintain the relationship and that sort of status without breaking down into, I'm judging you, I don't want anything to do with you if you're not going to be using plastic bags because I'm so impassioned to stop plastic pollution. And I think climate change would be similar in that sense. And what I realize is that it's almost like you kind of then pull back into like a quadrant 1 or a quadrant 2. We're like, okay, let me think about this more. How am I coming off? What could I do to provide a concrete example that might allow her to make sense of this or see things without me having to be judgmental? So that's where I started to share with her, like, you know, hey, Mom, I did another beach cleanup. And yeah, we're just, God, I can fill up an entire trash bag within an hour. And there's still way more to pick up. I would show her, you know, images of like, there's a famous turtle that has a plastic bag lodged into its throat because it thought it was a jellyfish. And it dies off because this plastic's out there in the ocean. That started to tap into her, where like she doesn't want to see a turtle choking on a plastic bag, the same plastic bag that she's getting from the store. So it took time for me and patience for me to recognize, where's the contact point. I know she cares. She cared about me growing up, and you know, she's you know, loved my sister and I, and we've been able to put together a family unit. So she has that. So how can I tap into that same space so she can see what I'm so impassioned about, which is ultimately I'm seeing harm. And once I realized that if I focus on the harm and give concrete examples, it tends to open up that space a little bit more, as opposed to I'm just judging you because our values are in 2 different areas on this topic.
Yeah, that was actually quite helpful. Thank you. I had a similar, I kind of have a running similar experience with a couple. My wife and I have a place up in rural Wisconsin, and there's a Jehovah's Witness couple that periodically show up, and I think we surprise them because we don't just tell them to get the hell out of there. And so I've kind of taken this stance of, okay, I want to ask them questions to learn about where they're coming from, and then share my perspective also, you know, but seek first to understand where they're coming from. And and one of the things in the over time that I through my questions and then responses to his questions, I revealed to him that, well, you know, I know a hell of a lot about the Bible. And that really shocked the guy a lot. I mean, it's like, holy smokes, how can this person know so much about the Bible and not believe the same things I do? And it's that willingness to engage over a long period of time that I think is probably going to be most helpful. And again, always seek to learn their perspective, learn more about it, and then also share my own perspective with them in a non-judgmental way. So yeah, I mean, I guess I really resonate with your story about you and your mother.
Thank you. And that reminds me, there was a guy named Daryl Davis, a Black man, who it made waves at the time, who managed to make his way into the KKK. And it's because he just wanted to listen, and like he got hatred, like, you know, they're calling him the N-word and everything. And he was like, I just want to know where you guys are coming from. Like, how do you come to see the world the way that you do? And they brought him in, and like he became friends with them. So it's just it's a really good testament that I think most human beings just really want to be heard and not easily dismissed and invalidated right off the bat. Like maybe the invalidation can come later down the road when enough evidence can really make itself evident. We're like, it's kind of like when you realize you're bullshitting and then you start to cognitively reflect and like, I need to pull back, I'm bullshitting too much. Like you don't want to get too far down that path. I think that's like an instinctual thing where we know we're getting more and more wrong. So yeah, I think there's a little bit in there that's a good practice.
Thank you.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for the great presentation. Maybe following on a little bit from that last point there, but the question I want to ask really is around, I don't know if you've come across the metamodern scene, and they have this kind of analysis that kind of the climate change, the climate disaster and the general environmental disaster is almost baked into modernity in its kind of extractive, reductionist extractive worldview, and the sort of deification of humankind, where we have this kind of implied omnipotence through science. Science gives us mastery over all of nature, etc. There's a whole kind of, and really that's an aesthetic scheme rather than, we talk a lot about reason and, and modernity loves to see itself as incredibly rational, but that whole worldview is really an aesthetic worldview rather than a rational worldview. So I'm wondering to what extent, and then this is where it becomes hard now to actually phrase this into a question, but to what extent do you try to work with these aesthetic schemes? Do you see kind of underpinning, like a lot of people in the metamodern scene would say, until we can change the metaphysics, it's going to be hard to get whole-scale change, because what you're really going to happen is even if people wake up to the crisis, what they're going to say is we need more engineering, because that's been sold for the last 300 years as the solution to everything. We need more engineering. We need particles blasted into the atmosphere. We need whatever. So, yeah, just that it's a bit of a vague question, but I think you're nodding, so I think you know where I'm coming from on this.
Well, so what I criticize in my work, well, first of all, taking a step back, which is like, okay, we have this really big issue. What the hell got us here? And to me, I look at power, actual power. What is causing human beings to pledge allegiance to something? We pledge allegiance to the products that we buy. We pledge allegiance to what makes us money. We pledge allegiance to the things that give us the lifestyle that we want to live. That's what we actually act on. Now, when I started to look at that, I'm like, okay, well, that's what people are following. So what's leading all of this? And you're right, science and STEM. For those that maybe are not familiar with STEM, it's an acronym. It's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And it's a framework here in the United States, especially in education, that they're trying to get earlier and earlier, like all the way into like pre-K and elementary. If you get students thinking about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, by the time they make their way through the school pipeline and get a college degree, they're going to be primed and ready for the economy or for industry, because that's who's paying a premium top dollar. Corporations around the world, if you have knowledge and skills in STEM, they want you. If you can do it at a high level, they want you even more. They'll pay for that. Like I moved to the Bay Area here in San Francisco, and this is like the cream of the crop. If you have a high level of knowledge and skills in STEM, whoa, they're going to pay you at least 6 figures. That's going to be the bottom floor. So I started to look at that power, and I'm like, what is this all about? And you're right, Steve, you're exactly right. We want to engineer our way out of this. And like Elon Musk, like I applaud his efforts with Tesla. I get what he's trying to do, but like you're literally shifting one injustice for another. Yes, you're helping us get off of fossil fuels in a lot of ways. That's really great. The lithium and cobalt and other rare earth elements that are needed to produce your batteries are creating injustices around the world right now. And there's all kinds of documentaries now that are coming out and showing how like lithium fields in Chile are disrupting water tables for local farmers. In the Congo, there are mining operations where thousands of community members are trying to dig up cobalt in these really like health risky ways. And it's very, very problematic. So we're not going to stem our way out of this and fix the issue. And this is where I thought that spiral dynamics could really be useful, because whoa, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, should we be consuming so much to begin with? Let's start there. And that's where it opens up that interpretation of how are other cultures in today's modern age experiencing the world? Are there other cultures who are operating differently than we do here in the States, where we don't have to consume so much. If we have solid shelter, if we can secure safe food and water, those are the basics. We can survive with the basics. And then from there, can we, make heating and air conditioning more available? Like, then we can start to get into like lifestyle comforts. But can we pull that back in a way to really learn from other groups and other ways of being, like indigenous communities? And I'm just bringing this back up onto the screen because it's just really, looking at other groups of humans in this Q4 space, and then really trying to understand an insider viewpoint of these other groups, that may actually create a cultural shift. That may have our leadership say like, oh God, yeah, we've been designing these policies all wrong. We should bring out these other nuances so we can have some forward movement, that we can exchange services and goods, but not do it at such an accelerated rate that we're filling up the ocean with plastic and creating this heat bubble on the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah. And just to say on that, there's people who are sort of talking about re-enchanting the world, and if you've come across that term, but there's a sense that the world is just seen as stuff, and that the enchantment actually came from kind of sci-fi movies, it's like the dream of living in a space station or whatever, and that's kind of where, I guess, where Elon Musk is heading. But the part of the answer to this has to be about kind of re-enchanting the world, actually seeing the kind of the magic that we seek in the world. And in its own, and revaluing the world, and realizing that I guess that's our original home, and reconnecting with myth and blah blah. But yeah, it sounds like you're on the same page.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, I would also just quickly argue that I think we've become hyper focused on the microscopic, meaning that like within STEM, we're focusing so much on how can we create a new chemical bond for a new type of plastic, or, how can we do all this nanotechnology for biomeds? And I'm not saying that those are necessarily bad things. It just kind of depends. But we got to pull back out to the telescopic, like, whoa. We're a very small speck. This fragile biosphere is resting in something much broader. Can that bring a sense of humility and wonder and curiosity? That really it's the human mind that wants to occupy itself. We don't have to consume a whole bunch to do that. If we start to learn like about stars, and we start to learn about science in ways that observes the natural world, that's where I find my humility. When I see like there's millions of species out there, how did that happen? I can learn about that for the rest of my life and be happy as the clam. So I don't need to like focus on, do I really just need to be consuming things all day to feel a purpose in life?
That's great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm next. So various things were coming to mind, Eric, and as you were giving the example of trying to bring to people's attention the notice in temperature during the summer, I've spoken about this in this group before, but I'm in the south of Spain, and people just expect Spain to be hot, especially the south of Spain. So if you tell them that the summers here are really hot, they'll just shrug their shoulders like, so what? But for me, it's been such a palpable increase in temperature. What used to be called a heat wave of a few days will literally last for months. It's insufferable. You can't go out into the street. And most houses are not well insulated here, and people are starting to buy air conditioners, which for me just makes the problem worse, because we're feeding into the electrical grid. So it's like one problem, like a supposed solution that's actually making the problem worse. And I've even had discussions with people online. I had a discussion with a woman who lives in Madrid, because there's some groups of expats who've moved to Spain, and Spain is supposed to be the Shangri-La of the world. There's a lot of like places that are kind of idealized as a good place to live, but Spain is very much idealized. And so in these groups, a lot of the people living here will encourage other people who are thinking about coming to come here. And the heat is never discussed. And something came up and I mentioned that it's getting really uncomfortable. And this woman in Madrid said, it's not a big deal. The bars are still wonderful. You can go out at night and, you know, don't make such a big deal about the environment. Don't make such a big deal about climate change. And I asked her if she had air conditioning in her house, and she never answered, because I don't have air conditioning. And I don't know if I'm going to have to at some point get it, just because it's 2 months of pain. And I hate to do that. I've been holding out for as long as possible, but I'm sure this woman has air conditioning. So, you know, and Spain has a very nice nightlife. So if you stay inside your house with air conditioning during the day and then you go out at night, everything seems fine, you know, but everything is not fine. So it's sort of like that, whatever your vision is of wanting to maintain the kind of comfort level. So that's kind of one thing. And then Josh and I talk about this a lot, because he always mentions that he's afraid that all the focus has gone on climate change and that we're not looking at many of the other issues. And he's right. There's so many things that are disconcerting. However, I feel like climate change just makes everything worse, because if we're having water table issues, I mean, the aquifers here in Spain, or I assume it's probably similar to the situation in Arizona. There's certain places that are just so dry and where the aquifers are almost totally gone. And that's partly because of human consumption and agriculture. I mean, we also have to just be honest about and it drives me crazy. I keep seeing these arguments online that if you took all the humans on Earth and put them together, they would only take up the space in Central Park in New York. Like, if you took all the masses of bodies and squished them together. I'm like, first of all, we don't live that way. Second of all, just look at the footprint that we actually take up our residences. And thirdly, look at the resources. This is kind of arguments you see circling online. Again, getting back to memes. And some of these memes that to me are not strong, they're very strong online and they're very transferable. They're very viral. So it's challenging. And then last night I went out, I'm just giving anecdotal quotes because I think it's interesting in the context of this conversation. I went out shopping, and I hate to go out shopping. I hate going into clothing stores because it's just loud music and too many people and sensory overload for me. And I noticed that the stores are no longer giving you bags. That was true in supermarkets, but now it's in clothing stores also. I don't know what it's like in the United States, but they don't, here in Spain, it seems that they now charge for bags. So they always ask you if you need a bag or not. So I think that's good. But it's just so ironic that another thing that I'm noticing, another trend is that there's so many products made out of fleece now. It's like fleece up to infinity, you know. I also see fleece blankets everywhere, just mountains of fleece blankets. And I think, okay, great that we're using less plastic bags supposedly, but what is fleece? It's polyethylene tetraflate, PET. It's a plastic. It comes from petroleum. We're using petroleum more than ever. And it feels like we make one small adjustment and it just feels like the smallest nod to the environment. But then on the other end of things, we're doing a million other things that are just actually increasing our consumption. And we're not even willing, speaking about critical thinking, I don't think anybody, I mean, I walk in and I admit I wear a lot of fleece stuff because it's warm. And it's almost impossible to find wool sweaters anymore. And we probably don't have enough sheep to shear to, okay, Josh is showing off his wool sweater. We probably don't have enough sheep to shear to make nice sweaters for everyone in the world because we've got 8 billion people on this planet now. So it's like, okay, it's true. We need these synthetic fibers to clothe everybody. But let's not pretend that we are decreasing our plastic use. And it's very difficult because I feel like I'm always thinking about these things and I don't feel like very many other people are. So I just keep it to myself. But I am, and this is the last thing I'm going to say because I'm kind of gabbing away, that I'm starting a nonprofit organization here, a local one that's just going to try to affect change locally, because I think a lot of us are coming to the conclusion that the best thing we can do is to affect local change. Because in this particular town, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, beautiful Renaissance stone buildings, but in the summer, it's getting so hot. And the city's just obsessed with bringing tourists. That's all they can think about. The economy, of course, that's what most local governments are worried about, the economy. So it's just, you know, keeping everything looking pretty so people will come here. But it's again, it's all stone, which absorbs the heat during the day. And we're not thinking about how we're grading the city to make it more livable. We're not talking about climate change at all. So I'm forming this organization from a spiral dynamics perspective to have that little bit of blue authority, because I'm not a government official. So having a group of citizens that say, look, this matters to us. You need to start thinking about this. This is important. And not only is it important because it's going to affect us all, this issue isn't going away, it's going to get worse, but also because it's going to hurt the tourism industry. People aren't going to want to come here if it's 115 degrees. You know, people are not going to want to come here during the summer. So not that we can change the emissions around the world. Locally, there's only so much you can do. But if we start planting trees now, because we don't have hardly any trees, maybe in 10 years down the road, at least it'll be greener and there'll be more shade and this kind of thing. At least we'll do something to mitigate. So this is sort of what I'm trying to do now to channel my own personal concerns locally. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. And when I was mentioning earlier that Josh was bringing up, like, you know, you might have somebody who might just be in opposition. And I use Flagstaff as an example because, Veronica, like what you were saying that you're experiencing, the contact point that I found for, let's say, like conservatives who didn't want to buy into climate change, mainly because the media that they watch propagandizes it and politicizes it. And it's like, okay, put all that aside. Where do you get your water from? Well, I get it from the city provides the water for me. That's right. Okay. Now the city gets their water from an aquifer. Did you know that our current population, which is growing, so Flagstaff, they're going through a huge growth spurt right now where developers from all over are descending and wanting to purchase forest land, like the federal government's going to sell it off to the state's going to then sell it off to the city, and then the city's going to open it up for development. And we basically have you know, developers coming in and installing entire neighborhoods, new neighborhoods. And when it comes to climate change and trying to contextualize this on a local level, I would talk to conservatives and be like, did you know that 82% of our water capacity is being used? Which means if we keep growing the population, if we hit 100% of our water capacity, what do you think is going to happen then? We're not going to have enough water. People are going to have to start having water restrictions. And if it really continues to grow and balloon out of control, what then? And they would be like, well, you know, we can always, you know, just drill deeper. We'll create new aquifers. Okay, well, maybe that might work. But at the same time, where's the money going to come from? Like, we're having housing issues that we're trying, like, you know, local government is diverting a lot of resources, and like inflation is hitting Flagstaff like crazy, where it's just the housing market is out of control. So where's the money going to come from to do that? We're having public health issues. We're having police hiring and maintaining issues. Like we can't keep enough people on the police force to stick around long enough. So how are we incentivizing people to operate in these different capacities? So, you know, money is of the essence. We just went through a pandemic. Like that hit a huge thing in tax revenue. So when you start to bring out those details, I think that's where it's almost like by default, by acting on a local level, you're helping people who are at, you know, red to get to like that blue into that orange space where, like, can you recognize that the pattern of complexity is if you take from this pot, these other issues are going to be impacted, which means they're going to have to take from other pots. And then where's that money? And then you start to really reveal that. And that usually tempers opposition and opens up dialogue of, okay, well, what are we going to do about it then? And that to me is probably the most beneficial space. So, you know, I can't speak for you and the locality, but I think when you have, you You know, and it sounds like you do. It sounds like when you have these larger understandings and you really want to bring it down to a concrete level on the ground, that it's utilizing that whole suite of language to pull back to the global, bring it into the local, and just constantly keep that flowing. So when you're trying to work on how do we change this, you can meet people where they're at in their understanding of these issues and really expand that awareness to see the kind of things that you're like, hey, I'm out here and this is going to hit Spain, it's going to hit tourism, it's going to hit housing, it's going to hit our energy grid. You know, that sort of thing gets people's attention because it's concrete and they can look at an actual physical example in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and it's going to impact all of us in different ways, and people definitely aren't thinking about it enough. And sometimes it's discouraging that these, what I consider to be anti-scientific memes or worldviews that are circling, how powerful they are and how persuasive they can be. And that's discouraging because if at least we were starting, I mean, it seems that even in the 1960s and 70s, there was still kind of, and I don't know that deference to authority is always a good thing. I mean, I know that we also need to be able to move beyond that. But, you know, I think generally in the past, everyone would agree that the moon landing did actually happen. And now it's hard to even get consensus on that. So how can we get consensus on climate change, which is an issue that will have such strong ramifications for so many people in the world a decade from now, 2 decades from now, 3 decades from now. So, yeah. And the other thing is that when you were talking about how to talk to people, so you were using your mom as an example. So there are cases where we're going to want to invest the time in certain people because it's worth it. But then there's going to be a lot of cases where it's not worth it. And then we're just going to have to decide about how we can channel our energy to do the good work, quote unquote. And Josh is always reminding me of this, how to do the good work and not get caught up trying to argue with people that's not going to get you anywhere. So, yeah, all things to be mindful of.
Yeah, and the main thing that I would say when it comes to climate change, and I've been saying this a lot, it's not about science and it's not about policy at this point. It's about trust. We have to get back to the basics of establishing ethics with others, just in our communication and relationship. That tends to be transformative. And like I go back and I read Ken's books, like I'm revisiting Sex, Ecology, Spirituality now, and he does a really good job at really thinking about his arguments and how might other people try to pick this apart and dismantle that. And then he rounds out like, you know, there are ways to communicate these things. So a lot of those ideas started with him. I didn't want to keep it in this philosophical realm. I wanted to like, you know, let me get out and talk to people and experience that first, and then see like, how does this whole integral model fit into that? But yeah, it really is about trust. And I think it really is about just tapping into the humanity of my relationship with others. And that it's like, I can't even quite articulate it because I can't control it. But if I can set the stage, it's almost like with a plant, I'm not trying to control the plant to grow. I'm trying to set the stage so it can just do what it's going to do. And that's kind of how I look at humanity.